Welcome to all of our guests today to the final event in a three-part series that is called A Picture of Health, A Politics of Disability and Illness, curated by me. I am Elizabeth Frost, Professor of English at Fordham University, together with my colleague and dear friend, the writer and disability arts advocate, Kenny Fries, who is also in the Zoom room today. In a moment, I will introduce our guest, Simon Watney, but first, some notes on access and the structure of our event. To self-describe briefly, I'm a late middle-aged white woman with shoulder-length brown-gray hair. I'm wearing glasses, and a gentle reminder to participants to self-describe briefly before speaking. This event offers ASL interpretation, and I would like to thank our two interpreters. They will use the spotlight function of Zoom to ensure that the interpretation is always visible. A reminder to pace your speaking so that our interpreters can do their work. And you can also display the closed captioning feature of Zoom by toggling it on or off on the Zoom menu on the bottom of your screen. If you have other questions about access, please write that into the chat and we will do our best to address them. I want to thank Fordham University for funding this series, and I would also like to pause for a moment to acknowledge that Fordham University occupies the unceded land of the Lenape people. This event will last 1 hour. Simon Watney will speak for about 20 minutes, and we will then have a Q&A, which will be led by several fabulous students currently taking my course, Introduction to Disability Studies. If time allows, we will open to additional questions, which we will also take via chat. So I am now thrilled to introduce Simon Watney. Watney is a British writer, art historian, and AIDS activist. In 1986, he published a crucial book about media representation of the HIV/AIDS crisis called Policing Desire, Pornography, AIDS, and the Media. His later work, Imagine Hope, Gay Identity and AIDS, from 2002, brought attention to the personal impact of HIV/AIDS, especially among those living with the highest levels of illness, death, and mourning. In 2020, Watney published an interview with the Huffington Post that was entitled Reimagining Hope. To give some context, this event series as a whole is one component of a project that Kenny and I have collaborated on called A Picture of Health, Joe Spence, A Politics of Disability and Illness. Our project's website, and this event will later be available recorded on that website. Our website places the work of the radical artist and activist Joe Spence in the context of the lived experience of chronic illness and disability, and that includes work by Simon Watney. In 1987, Watney brought together many of those he knew who were interested in both community-based photography and issues around HIV/AIDS. And this included Spence, with whom he had a long-standing friendship. With Spence, together with Patricia Holland, he edited Photography / Politics 2, a book of projects and essays reflecting debates about photographic education and practice. The friendship that Spence and Watney shared reflected their joint commitment to intersectional approaches to understanding illness and its construction in culture. And we are hugely honored and excited to have Simon with us today to talk about his activism, his writing about HIV/AIDS, and also his shared work with Joe Spence. Thank you so much, Simon, for being with us today.
Elizabeth, thank you, and Kenny, thank you very much for inviting me to take part in your course, which is a great pleasure for me. I feel a long way outside the academy, but I still have many friends who are teachers, and an event like this brings together both friends like Joe, who died a long time ago now, who was considerably older than me. She was born in 1934. I was born in 1949. And yet now, here I am, 74. Joe didn't even get to 60. So I'm considerably older than she was when she died. And I think all of you who are younger will reach this strange self-consciousness that if you're lucky to live long enough, you find in relation to those you've known and loved who've died long before you. For me, Jo's project, her work, is very much active still. I think of her a lot. I find a distinction between friends I remember best are the ones I argue with in my head. I think, what would Jo have thought? I often know what she would have thought because we didn't necessarily agree on things. But let me go back a little bit here. Jo, as I say, was born in 1934. In other words, she grew up as a little girl before the Second World War, as the clouds were darkening over Europe. She came from quite a humble working class background. Both her parents were factory workers. She had a younger brother, baby brother. She had two sisters. There wasn't much money. Her father was very strict and caring. Her mother, I think, was overwhelmed with the task of mothering and making ends meet, and had a certain tendency, I think, to what we would call depressive illness. Though, of course, immediately there's a danger of pathologizing class issues here. The effect of poverty and of their class position, Jo would have been the first to want to acknowledge and talk about. And then to think about the psychological impact of class and poverty on one another, and on gender, of course. As the war developed, in the first year of the war, very little happened in London. And then suddenly there was the Blitz, an enormous amount of bombing, and large numbers of children were moved out of the cities of England to safer places in the countryside. This happened to Jo 3 times as a child. She was moved out, first of all, not so far from London, to south of the river into rural Surrey. Then, a second move, she was sent off way to the west of England, to Cornwall, where she was very unhappy. And then on a third, having come back to her family, she went away on a third trip to Derbyshire in the north of England, to a mining family, again, this time with her little baby brother. So she was very much in loco parentis, in a mothering role to her baby brother there. And they stayed very close all their lives. That experience of being evacuated, the evacuation of school children, was branded on Jo's memory. It was an absolutely formative experience, as was her, I think, very unstable, in a sense, disturbed relationship with her parents, because as a child, of course, you don't understand the situation or the circumstances that your parents find themselves in. They were trying to protect her, but of course she felt abandoned. And there's no easy resolution, of course. It takes a lifetime of, and just a lifetime to try and work those things out. And in many ways, Jo's practice as a photographer might be seen as a lifetime attempt to resolve those early dilemmas, as is the case probably for all of us. In Jo's case, that meant, for example, a little bit further down the line, rediscovering her mother by acting out her mother, literally in performative ways in front of the camera when she was diagnosed with cancer. It's worth recalling here the strange roots that memory has, that it took the severe trauma of a cancer diagnosis for Jo to be able to turn around and rediscover and own her mother and hold her mother and be held by her mother, which is the action that a lot of Jo's photography is actually about. I'm speaking largely from memory here, so if I get things wrong, I do my best. I knew Jo well. She had a terrifically strong personality. She didn't suffer fools gladly, as they say. She didn't take hostages, as they say. She endlessly talked about the importance of collective work and cooperation. However, there were not many groups in which she participated in which she wasn't the dominant force. And I think a lot of people in the history of her career there were lots of disputes and feuds. I think that's true, though, for many people who come from backgrounds, especially who are largely self-taught. Jo was completely failed as a child by her school. She had no qualifications at all. She left school at 15. I don't think she ever dreamt that she would go to college or study. She discovered a series of different jobs just to keep herself going, to bring in some money. And then she discovered photography, professional high street photography, just like the photography that your parents and grandparents knew on Main Street all over America and on the high streets of Europe. Commercial professional photographers employed to photograph endless babies squirming and squealing on endless big cushions, endless weddings, endless bar mitzvahs, endless funerals. That was the work that Jo did. And she learnt not only the skills of darkroom printing and of working a camera, but also, I think, social skills that she wouldn't have otherwise had, if that makes sense. I'm just looking at my watch for time here. That background in professional photography was accompanied by a social experience. It was the 1950s. She became what we called a beatnik, French style. She loved Juliette Gréco, the French singer. She was very much part of beatnik culture before the advent of the swinging 60s. Jo, in that period, met Terry Dennett, who was really to be her life partner and best friend. Terry was a very convinced and ardent socialist from the far left, and he had an enormous impact on Jo. And I think there's one of the many things that's rare and unusual about Jo's history is that she began her political life not in a liberal way, moving to the left, but on the contrary, she started right in the far left in a way, and subsequently discovered feminism, what we would now call identity politics, and moving on to debates about representation and the politics of representation. And later on, towards the end of her life, her vital, life-affirming involvement with disability issues, with illness, and with mortality at the end of her life. So it was a particularly interesting and unusual journey, in a way, from a kind of hard left class politics. Terry was very much involved in East European politics, in East Germany, in the fallout of the Second World War, the whole tragedy of the fallout of the Second World War in Europe. And Jo, in a way, had to unlearn, I think, in a way, in her later life, some of the certainties that she'd discovered in the 50s and 60s. But that's another story for another day. What I'd like to say for now is that looking back over Jo's career, she always called herself a cultural producer. And I can well remember having a discussion with her. Oh, it must have been a long way into the 1980s, very late 1980s, and saying to her, look, Jo, for heaven's sake, just try to say out loud, I am an artist. It's a word you're allowed to say. You won't be taken away and locked up if you call yourself an artist. Of course, you're a cultural producer, we all are, but you're also something else. There are certain things you do which are, we can call them art. And it was hard for her because she'd had a career in which she'd never met anyone who'd been to art school. She didn't have any contact with the institutions of the art world. When she studied photography, she went to study at the Polytechnic of Central London, which was a course very much dedicated to the politics of representation. I taught on that course as a very young man for many years, together with Victor Bergin and Nina Kellgren, who was and still is a wonderful filmmaker and camera operator, and Maggie Murray, feminist photographer who worked with Jo and in another group she was part of called the Hackney Flashers. But I mention all this only because Jo, older than me, whom I'd known before she went to college, decided that she wanted to have a degree. And she was already in her late 40s, I imagine. And going to college was a big act of faith for her. It was difficult. I think she had, on the one hand, enormous anxiety, class anxiety about going into an institution about which she knew nothing, where she feared she was going to be judged. And I think that should remind all of us, again, about the dimensions in working within further and higher education there. Not often acknowledged, I think. At the same time, she had a magical fantasy, I think, that somehow going to college would give her the answers. Here are these people, Victor Bergin, Simon Watney, they know the answers. But of course, that's not how it is. You can give people reading lists, you can try and encourage people, you can try and intuit what might be helpful, but more than that, that's not what education is there to do. It's not to tell people what to think. I can remember supervising Jo's dissertation, which was about the theme of Cinderella. We all know the story of Cinderella, Cinders with the two cruel older sisters who discovers the Prince Charming, the strange magical shoe, the slipper, from whatever source. Jo, however, had the greatest difficulty distinguishing in her mind between what was required of her, which was simply an essay, a dissertation, and a book. And it was what she eventually produced was practically the weight of the Encyclopedia Britannica. It was gigantically overlong. It was enormously overambitious. It was wonderfully so, majestically so even. But I had the unhappy task of trying to persuade her to edit this enormous, extraordinary history of fairy tales, psychoanalysis, everything, every possible version of Cinderella you could ever meet, into something that was manageable. And not only manageable, but which was about photography. That was the key issue, of course, because she was studying photography, after all. I was friends with an English writer called Angela Carter, who was my best girlfriend, in fact, who wrote a lot on fairy tales. And I remember bringing Angela into the college to give a talk for Jo's benefit as much as anybody else's about fairy tales. And I only wish I had some sort of record of that meeting of the two of them. Angela died very ridiculously and sadly young, about a year after that meeting, long before Jo. And again, they're two friends I love dearly and for whom I learnt a lot and whom I miss a lot to this day. I thought I might end up, since I've only got 5 or 10 minutes at most, just very briefly, if I might, running through a sequence of holding up to the camera a sequence of texts which seem to me important, starting off with this catalogue. From 1979, 3 perspectives on photography, about contemporary photography in Britain. The second section of which was edited by Angela Kelly, whom some of you may have met or know, who lives and works in America now. And Jo wrote a long article in this catalogue, setting out her wares, as it were. Angela Kelly's introduction says, quoting Simone de Beauvoir, representation of the world, like the world itself, is the work of men. They describe it from their point of view, which they confuse with absolute truth. So it's a feminism which is historically grounded. It's a feminism which is very much involved with wider representational issues. And immediately, Jo's essay in the catalogue brings us into that dialogue between the baby, the infant, and the adult, which was to be so important throughout her career. I shall put that to one side. It also has an essay by the Hackney Flashers, which was a group of feminist photographers, mainly doing documentary work, but image text work, photography using text to enhance and to analyze the meaning of the photography. Jo was a part of that group for many years. The first book she edited, together with Terry Dennett, her partner, took many years to edit. It was self-published by the Photography Workshop, which was an educational project in the East End of London, which had different addresses over the years. It ended up having an important gallery called the Camera Work Gallery on Roman Road, off in the working class East End of London. And this was an anthology of essays about the uses of photography and the history of photography. There's a lot in here by Terry Dennett about working class photography, worker photography in East Germany. It's very much from an old left perspective. That group of people she worked with, her collective, then embraced me, and I joined in, or was invited to join the group, and we then edited a second volume, Photography Politics 2, which has a huge range of essays from every aspect you could imagine, really. I wrote a long article on how one thinks about the institutions of photography. I'm not a sociologist, but the sociology of photography is a neglected task. Then she moved on to an autobiographical book, not offering a conventional narrative, and with very few dates in it, which can be rather maddening if you're trying to find things out about where she was at a particular time, but analysing through her own photo archives the chronology of her life. Very close to that book is a book that gets forgotten, but I think it's a wonderful book that she co-edited with Patricia Holland, who was also a co-editor with me for Photography Politics 2. And this is exactly what it says it is, Family Snaps. It's a book about family albums, about all of the way in which photography, whether analog or digital, is used to anchor and hold together and indeed constitute our sense of our families. It has a very illustrious cast of writers, including myself, dare I say, Val Williams and Annette Kuhn, many very well-known feminists. It's a terrific book, which was published in 1991. It really should be republished online it's ridiculously expensive now. Another grand overview, Cultural Sniping, which is actually quite cheap to get hold of. I hold this up again, advertise it. I noticed just yesterday that you can still get this for less than $20 easily. Going on from that towards her later life, as she was struggling with cancer and coming out the other side of cancer and back into health, What Can a Woman Do with a Camera? Written and edited together with her friend Joan Solomon, whom she met through feminist and disability workshops and mental health workshops as well, dealing with the psychological aspects of illness, which is a fascinating, and I can only recommend it to you. Coming towards the end of this sequence, the catalogue of an enormous posthumous show that her partner Terry Dennett organised in Barcelona in about 2010. I can't remember the exact date. You can look it up for yourselves. But it's a very substantial anthology of Jo's writings and work chronologically, and an indispensable equivalent to a catalogue raisonné. Then there's a posthumous final book, which again I want to end up by talking about a little, because it is extraordinary work. She was sadly diagnosed with leukemia, having battled through the experience of breast cancer. Jo had taken a difficult route. She wasn't ever going to take things lying down in this life. And she opted, after her cancer diagnosis, not just for the conventional chemotherapy or radiotherapy, but she also looked to alternative and complementary medicine. This infuriated and saddened some of her friends who were strictly rationalists, who thought she was being irrational or superstitious. I learned a very, very important lesson at that point from Jo, that is about respecting the choices of anyone facing chronic illness, let alone potentially terminal illness or palliative care. And learning from Jo to try and be supportive of her different responses to her illness proved for me enormously helpful in my later work in HIV/AIDS, which overlapped with Jo's illness as well. And I think many other people I can think of who are no longer alive would want to thank Jo as well for being out there ahead of us, in terms of respecting the difficulty of the choices people make and the importance of supporting people in the choices they make. Finally, just very recently, one of a gallery in London and people in Canada have reproduced her dissertation, The Mighty Great Tome, which I helped advise her on as her tutor when she was a student. And it's been reproduced exactly as it was delivered. It is indeed a gigantic, over long and over weighty, but this is probably a tenth of what it was when I first saw it. It's well worth looking at just to get a sense of how Jo worked and the inclusive, embracive approach towards her sources. She worked very closely, as we all did, with Stuart Hall, the great Black Caribbean theorist and intellectual and television filmmaker. And I think it was Stuart who encouraged Jo to get into TV, and she made 2 or 3 important television films, which I'm sure you can probably find access to online one way or another, in which she speaks for herself far more eloquently than I can. But I think she would want me to say in conclusion, in terms of disability and disability politics, that her experience in working with an often unsympathetic medical profession didn't mean that she wanted to turn her back on science, and that the kinds of alliances that are made now between different patient groups for example, people with long COVID right now can draw on the experience and the literature and the cultural production of the arts response to AIDS and earlier continuously to cancer. We have now a whole new arena of dialogue between different patient groups with different experiences of the health service institutions in our different countries. Very different, of course, in the United States, I think, from Europe, even at the very moment in which, sadly, market forces are being imposed on socialized medicine, as I speak in this country, in the United Kingdom. I feel that particularly acutely because I had HIV long ago, and if I didn't take my drugs, I'd peg out pretty quickly. But the treatment drugs that emerged in the mid-1990s saved my life, whereas so many other people I knew sadly died. What's slowing me down now is the fact that I used to smoke and I have emphysema, and I'm very limited in my mobility, and my mobility is very unpredictable. I'm not talking about myself from a point of view of self-pity, but only in a very mechanical sense to point out that all of us are likely to accumulate different diagnoses unexpectedly and surprisingly, which we do our best to manage. Those diagnoses endlessly, we're assisted in that task by sharing them with others, as Jo, in her educational work and all the work I've tried to show you today, was attempting to reach out to younger people to complete the task that she herself didn't sadly live to complete. I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Simon, thank you so much for that extraordinary history and for your generosity in giving us that portrait of Jo Spence, of your relationship with her, and of the tenets that guided her practice as well as your own. It's a great gift. So thank you very deeply. Yeah, we're thrilled to have this on record. I have an extraordinary array of students in the Zoom room here who have wonderful questions for you. And many of them, I believe, are going to take us more into your own history and work as we hope will be okay with you, since you've told us so much about Jo. So I think I will let them navigate that at this point, and feel free to call on me if anyone would like a little input. But I'm going to kind of, if you will, hand over the mic to them.
Hi, my name is Isabella Nave, and I am a 21-year-old white woman with shoulder-length blonde hair. And I wanted to say thank you so much for giving us more personal insight and information about Jo Spence. It's really beneficial to our class and previous discussions and creating new connections to her work. Just to dive a little bit deeper into your own personal work, I wanted to ask a question regarding media. We engaged with your interview, Reimagining Hope, and then also your work of The Spectacle of AIDS. And in combination with both of those works, I just wanted to ask how in the past, the media contributed significantly to society's perception of individuals with HIV and AIDS at the onset of the epidemic. And there was certainly an agenda within the press and the media to establish gay men as threats to concepts of family and tradition. And in current times, media is still playing a large role in the distribution of information regarding HIV and AIDS, specifically regarding treatments and medications such as PrEP that you spoke about in your interview. Yeah. And I just wanted to ask, do you think that the companies today and the individuals running them and are in charge of creating the content that is distributed out into society are still following a particular agenda? in terms of an agenda speaking about, is there specific tactics being used that are still resulting in separation in the conversation of HIV and AIDS? Is it still preventing more people receiving proper information and learning about with the realities of HIV and AIDS and how to be medically proactive with it, and also preventative measures? And I just wanted to get your opinion on how the tactics of the media have changed and if they're still harmful.
I think that's a very interesting question. It's a hard one for me to answer succinctly, but I'll do my best. I think there was if we think back now to 40 years ago, 1983, there was a meeting in Denver, Colorado, which resulted in the Denver Principles, they were called. And this was a meeting of people with AIDS diagnosed in New York, San Francisco, all over the United States and further afield. I had a friend who was there, I knew from Norway. So it was also international. And it was a meeting which decided, the Denver Principles asserted that we shouldn't talk about people with AIDS as victims, but we should talk about people with AIDS rather than AIDS victims. And it set an agenda which was around self-identity, but also about cultural identities and representations. And it was a key moment in the history of the epidemic, particularly in America, because the epidemic was so much worse there and was running several years ahead of the rest of the world. There wasn't much of an agenda about race in the Denver Principles because the appreciation of the racial dimensions of HIV wasn't yet recognized. This was a year before HIV was even identified. You didn't have people with HIV. You didn't have that group of people didn't exist. There was only people with AIDS, with late stage illness, many of whom were chronically, severely ill. So that was an incredibly important debate 40 years ago. And yet now, today, we have, the agenda of the culture wars, which can always fall back, as you know, on women's reproductive rights, on LGBT issues, on racism, on all our old friends that are the primary psychic anxieties of the world we live in. Anxieties about difference, anxieties, particularly anxieties about how we use our bodies and body functions. Projection being absolutely crucial here. Creating constituencies of fear and constituencies of anxiety. And I think the commercial media will always, I'm afraid, be drawn towards tactics which enable them to sell their product on the corner of the street, or else through subscriptions online, one way or the other. The profit motive looks to the lowest common denominator, I'm afraid. And that's the issue which we face. It's extremely depressing to see after all these years that the same old tropes of, the dangers that gay men or lesbians supposedly hold towards children. These are the anxieties of which I thought had been banged on the head, as it were, long ago. But of course, they never go away. They're not simply discrete little issues. They are something bound in, I'm afraid, with the view of the world, of the modern world, of modernity. And many people are vulnerable to those fears, especially if they have no direct experience of people of colour, or of lesbians and gay men, or of the other figures who are caricatured in the culture wars, just as we were caricatured in the early years of the epidemic. But I think in conclusion, the one thing I would say is that, I'm really quoting, not exactly, but more or less quoting the American critic Douglas Crimp, that the most terrible aspect of that coverage at the time was that the media were demonizing people who were at their most vulnerable, at the end of life situations, who've been often shamed and humiliated in their care by their carers, often rejected by their families, often insulted by their neighbours even. To have a media campaign turning them into devils as well at that stage was particularly cruel and callous. And he said, Douglas Crimp this is, that seldom has a society turned its back so cruelly, as it were, on a constituency of need. And I think that's the lesson we learn here of how different constituencies still can unexpectedly become vulnerable to the processes of marginalization and of demonization.
Thank you so much, and I think that's a great place to leave off for my follow-up question. I just wanted to ask that regarding public health crises, as someone who has lived through both the AIDS epidemic and now the COVID-19 outbreak, what parallels and what differences in the ways that public officials and the media, or just even in general, that you've seen and witnessed have affected the possibility and the severity, the possibility of relief and also the severity of, both public health crises for the individual and for the public?
The important thing, as you're implying, is that public health learns from the experiences of the past in order to be able to produce effective, preemptive strategies rather than having to be always following behind in a reactive way. It's the nature of public health to be reactive, of course, because most epidemics emerge unexpectedly by definition, either from new pathogens like HIV or COVID, or from the re-emergence of pathogens like measles, because people have been persuaded to give up on vaccines or not to vaccinate their children because of media scares and other such, craziness as we see these days. I think very little, sadly, was learned from the experience of HIV/AIDS because I fear that it was seen as a kind of exceptionalist narrative that affected only minority groups or the marginalized. I don't think it was believed by many healthcare professionals that there were lessons for general public health to be learned retrospectively from HIV/AIDS. And I think that's tragic, because one of the things that HIV/AIDS does teach us is, for example, the possibility of successful preventative medicine and health promotion. The story of condom promotion in the history of the epidemic is quite extraordinary if you compare it to any other aspect of public health in the last 100 years. It was a small-scale, cheap intervention, not from the heart of the medical profession, but from the outside, from a small group of people with AIDS, Michael Callan and Dr. Joseph Sonnabend, his carer, and another friend of theirs who was a patient of Joe's as well, Richard Berkowitz. They published a little self-published leaflet in 1983, How to Have Sex in an Epidemic, mimeographed, which changed the world, and it really did. It became the model for people setting up health promotion campaigns all over different cities in America, in Canada, Australia. I took copies back to London. It was the basis of our work. It promoted the idea of risk reduction. It said we can never eliminate risk. You can't eliminate. We have to live with risk. How do we reduce it? It's that model of risk reduction, which I think, of course, worked in relation to COVID to some extent, but it was delayed. It was disputed. There's an inquiry going on here in this country, in Britain at the moment, retrospectively about our government history in relation to COVID. And it's a sorry story, I'm afraid, of opportunities being lost, of personal careers getting in the way of public health, of money making and profiteering left, right, and centre. I think the problem is that public health comes second to profiteering so often. That's all I think I can say. But if you are ever writing a history of AIDS or a history of the COVID, the key issue is indeed to answer your question. What are the 3 practical or 4 practical issues we learn from this experience, this historical experience? That should always be the question in one's mind.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to pass it over to another speaker.
Well,
My name is Sophie Manella. I am a 20-year-old brunette white woman. And just with your conversations about medication earlier and this idea of risk prevention, I wanted to ask that with more emerging PrEP drugs being created and advertised to individuals, do you find that companies provide fewer forms of information and education regarding the medication, since the target market is typically the LGBTQ plus community? And how can society create more transparent conversations about treatment and preventative drugs that do not allude to medications being the absolute solution to HIV and AIDS?
Thank you for your question. I think one could say, to generalize to begin with, that the medications that one may want to take as antibiotics, say, may be adequate and sufficient to prevent an infection. But they don't, that's not the end of taking care of ourselves and protecting ourselves generally from an environment which is sadly very rich in pathogens, only too rich in unnecessary pathogens as well. So what we eat, the environment of our bodies generally, has, as we know, an immediate impact directly and indirectly on our health, on our life expectancy, on on our well-being. How we find a way of not becoming overly obsessed, I think, with the sense of omnipresent danger around us, and how we don't put all our eggs into one basket of trusting our doctors to do everything for us, is part of the challenge. It's part of a wider challenge, isn't it, about encouraging all of us to think about the degrees of control we can exercise in our lives. I think it's very difficult if we expect people as isolated individuals to be able to exercise complete control over their health and over all the risks and dangers that the world presents to us. We have to depend on one another. We have to believe that the bus driver who's taking us home isn't drunk. We have to believe that the safety training for people working in an office block includes working the lifts, should the lifts back up. We have to endlessly make decisions in which we delegate responsibility to others. Now, if that breaks down, our society has broken down. Our society depends on that matrix of trust, and trust in one another. And I think in the answer to your question, when do we think that our doctors, for example, are working out of a profit motive rather than our own interests as patients? Now, this is a very profound and disturbing question, I think, these days. When do we take a second option? How can anyone afford to take a second option? How do we promote public health when so many people can't even afford the most elementary health insurance? So the question of our own personal responsibility to exercise, to see ourselves as part of the environment and our health as being an environmental issue is crucial. But I think we shouldn't blame ourselves too heavily or expect too much of ourselves as individuals in a society which has industrialized danger for profit at every level. How we negotiate that situation without encouraging people to be permanently terrified, I think is an enormous challenge. I've always thought that on the whole, fear isn't the best way to motivate people to long-term change. If you keep telling people, it's a question of Chicken Little, it's the old story of if you scream fire all the time, people just shrug their shoulders. Much better to encourage, as condom use showed us, the publicity for condom use, that this is a possibility. And I think that's the best I can respond to your question.
Thank you so much. That was really insightful. I think if time allows, we have one more question.
Hello.
Oh, hello.
Hi. My name is Sophia. I am a white woman. I am 20 years old and I have brown medium length hair. And I would like to ask the question, in many conversations regarding disability, illness, and other experiences that results in the othering of individuals, the term normalization is often used. Do you find that within the topic of HIV and AIDS, using terms such as normalization dismisses the experiences, history, and struggles that individuals face when living with HIV becomes their reality?
Phew, that's a big question. How can I say? I'm quite a long way now from the kind of nerve center of the response to HIV/AIDS. I have younger friends who are still working in non-government organizations, and others who are doctors and carers. I don't myself hear the word normalization so much, therefore, in my everyday life. And I'm turning my head. Can you give me some examples of what uses of the term normalization that you're thinking about?
In the interview with HuffPost, the speaker, he asked, in what ways can we normalize HIV and AIDS in order to combat the fear that people have?
Okay, sure. I see what you mean. Yes. Well, I can see why you would want to ask the question if the people with AIDS are being set up, as they so often were and are, as completely as othered, as you suggest, as if we were people on another planet. HIV is a retroviral condition. It generated a huge amount of anxiety because of the media storm that surrounded it, which was so cynical, and because of the attendant scandal that goes with it now. For example, I can give you one example that springs to mind: the war in Ukraine at the moment. One of the awful, sad side effects of the war in Ukraine is the enormous challenge of getting HIV medication to people with HIV in Ukraine. And that has to be a whole targeted area, not only of fundraising, but of actual delivery, of finding a mechanism to get things through. I think anyone can understand what it would be like to be in a situation where, because a country invaded your own home country, you suddenly couldn't get your medication. And there will be various constituencies of people with medical needs in the Ukraine, as in Israel, as things happen, as disasters happen around the world. Unexpected crises occur. The answer, therefore, has to be, how do we get our NGOs or government agencies and others to be able to respond not just to the kind of public tragedy of the war in Ukraine, but to the very specific targeted needs of particular groups of people who one can identify as likely to be vulnerable. And that requires a certain degree of insight and current understanding of healthcare delivery systems in different parts of the world. So, yes, there's a degree of one wants to be normalized, in the sense that you don't want to be seen as a kind of radiating source of danger or toxicity. But at the same time, AIDS has presented, I suspect, a particular range of issues, of alignments, if you will, which have made it rather different to many other illnesses, not least the fact that it was so easily transmitted in the early years by particular modes of transmission, that it was so widely transmitted, that it was so pathogenic and so dangerous, and yet suddenly the treatment became available. That narrative is an unusual narrative in the history of medicine in such a relatively short space of time. So those of us who find ourselves now as long-term survivors have often lived through an extraordinary curve in which you've seen vast numbers of your contemporaries die, and yet suddenly you yourself have been reprieved. And fortunately now, younger people who've been diagnosed since the mid to late 1990s, when treatment drugs became available, are able, mercifully, and thank goodness, to be able to lead lives in which HIV is relatively can be pushed to one side and not dominate your life. But there's a downside to that. In the early years, where people had a strong identity as people with AIDS or people with HIV, the epidemic was visible. It was visible on the terms of the people with the illness, on the terms of the disabled, if you will, if we want to return to that category. What the availability of treatments and the increased life expectancy did, paradoxically, was to gag the central constituency involved. You had no more people with AIDS. You had no more people with HIV. It wasn't heard. You knew people with HIV, but you never knew it, or you forgot it. It no longer figured. And I think that's the dimension that I would invite you to think about as an issue. What happens when identities shift and what does it mean today to say in public, I am a person with HIV, compared to what it meant 20 years ago, let alone, in 1984, 85, when testing first became available. Anyway, thank you. It's a good question.
Thank you.
Okay. I'm just going to make myself a spotlight again to wrap up. I wish we had another 2 hours to be with you, and perhaps some of us can actually follow up with you in some form. And I just want to thank you so very much for your generosity today. And I think that there's just so much more to say. So with that, I will kind of, with some sadness but also gratitude, wrap up for today. And I want to thank the students. I want to thank you so very much, Simon, our interpreters, my friend Kenny Freeze, and everyone who's tuned in today. And we will load eventually the recording of this event onto the Joe Spence website. And we're so grateful for your contributions in so many areas. So thank you very much. And I'll close out the meeting now.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Kenny.